Good morning again. We are in Perek Chafhei, chapter 25, the very last Perek in Sefer Melachim Bet, and it's a strange coincidence that we're learning about the destruction today of Yerushalayim on the very same week where we celebrate Yom Yerushalayim, the beginning of its rebuilding. And maybe we'll learn some of those lessons, maybe some of those things will tie in. If you recall, Yechonyam, who was a previous king, had been taken out into Galut. And when he was taken out, we then, in his place, Tzidkiyahu was put into power. Tzidkiyahu was, again, a vassal king to the king of Bavel. And that's where we're picking up the story. Now, before we go any further, I did send to you Chaim Tadmor's listing of the kings, just as a moment to go back and remember where we came from, in terms of this story of the second book of Melachim. And just to go back that step, if you look, and the main messages really, which I wanted you to see, is if you look in Yehudah, which is the column on the right, all of the kings, one way or the other, are from Malchut Beit David. That's just the nature. It was a continuation. If you look at the length of their reigns, you see that when the reign begins to be very short, that's when the problems occur. On the left side, which is Malchut Yisrael, well, there we see you have these series of dynasties of Yeravam and Basha and Omri and Yehu and then Menachem, and how each of these pieces start playing out. Tzidkiyahu is the third brother who has been placed in his role as the king. Yehoiachim, and Tzidkiyahu, and when we encounter, I'm sorry, Yoachaz, and then Yehoiachin and Tzidkiyahu, when we encounter him, we ultimately encounter a king who's finding himself betwixt and between the two great empires. He's still looking to Egypt for some sort of salvation. He is also at this time, we do see this in Sefer Yirmiyahu, we're not going to be learning it inside, that already in the fourth year of his reign, he is considering rebelling against Bavel. And that rebellion is encouraged by false prophets. Yirmiyahu is the true prophet during his monarchy, but Yirmiyahu was really a prophet of destruction and doom. He was not a person he was a person who foretold what was going to happen, who warned the people and warned the king, and yet he was unsuccessful. He is the author of Eicha. Yirmiyahu is the author of our Sefer as well, and Yirmiyahu is also the author of his own Sefer. And so we see him in this unusual role that he finds himself, and Tzidkiyahu is not listening to him. And so we encounter the beginning of the parak with the words, Vayihi bishnat hatshi'it l'malcho b'chodesh asiri b'asor l'chodesh, that it was the ninth year of his reign. The ninth year of his reign, in the 10th month. Well, when we start having, obviously, when we understand it's the 10th month, it's Tevet, and this is going to remind us on the 10th of the month, in other words, Asara b'Tevet, our fast day. And in that point, it was already the 17th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Ba Nebuchadnezzar, Melech Bavel, hu v'chol chelo al Yerushalayim. Nebuchadnezzar came with this massive army. Obviously, wasn't his entire army, but as we say often in the Gemara language, Ruba Kikula, you have this mass, it's considered as if it's everything, and that's what he appeared. Vayichan aleh, vayivnu aleha dayek saviv. And they encamped on the city of Yerushalayim, and they built over it a dayek saviv. Now, a dayek, the Radak says, was a large tower, and it's a wooden tower that they would build in order to be able to see over the walls and to begin the conquest of the city, to be able to plan. The Dat Mikra actually says that in Aramite, the word dek is actually to see. So it's a lookout tower. In other words, they would build it, and they would be able to lidayek, to be able to be precise in their form of attacks of what they were going to be doing. Evan Shoshan actually goes a step further. He says that this was not just a lookout tower, but this was also a tower from which they would begin to shoot. It comes, if you, in Akkadit, which was a Semitic language, ancient Akkadian, there is a word, we find the word in their documents of Dayiku, which is the same word which is referring to this kind of tower. Vatavo ha'ir b'matzor, and the city was placed under a siege ad ashtei esrei shana lemelech Tzidkiyahu, until the 11th year of Tzidkiyahu. One more time, this form, and we find this elsewhere in Tanakh, ashtei asar. Ashtei asar is again, originally it's a Semitic, and it's an ancient Semitic form. It's 1/10. In other words, it's Ashatei Asar is 1/10 of a 10. In other words, one. Again, in Akkadit, you have the same term. It's a Istin, which is Astei, is the one. And the Matzor, which actually happened, if you think about it, it starts in Tevet. The year changes over in Nisan, so you have 4 months at that point. You have another 12 months during the 10th year of Tzidkiyahu's reign. And then we go from Nisan until Chodesh Av, where we know is going to be the destruction. And in that case, it's another 4 months. So it's going to be a siege of a year and a half over the course of 3 royal years. In the Jewish kingdom, the kings are always, their reign is always counted from Nisan. First of Nisan is considered the beginning of the reign. And so if a king rose to his position, let's say the second to the last day of Adar, the month right before Nisan, nevertheless, once he hits Nisan, he's considered the second year of his reign. So it's 3 royal years, actually only about 18 months. But during that course of the 18 months, as we read in Eicha, the siege was severe, and the famine and the actions of the people in trying to save themselves from the famine was horrific. בתשעה לחודש ויחזק הרעב בעיר ולא היה לחם לעם לאכול. And now in the ninth day of the month. Now, what is that ninth day of the month? According to Yirmiyahu, the parallel text in Perek Lamed Tet in Yirmiyahu Pasuk Bet, this is the Chodesh HaRevi'i. This is Tammuz, on the ninth day of Tammuz. Interestingly, we're going to encounter a problem, because this is going to be the day in which the walls of the city are breached. We'll see it in the next Pasuk. But here in Malachim, it says on the ninth day. We know that when it comes to Tammuz, the breaching of the walls that we commemorate are Shiva Asar on the 17th day, 8 days difference. And so as a result, the Gemara in Tanit and Daf Chet Amud Bet says that Tanya Barishona Uvka'a Ir B'Tish'a B'Tammuz, that in the first Beit HaMikdash, the walls were breached on the ninth of Tammuz. Bashniya, on the second Beit HaMikdash, b'Shiva Sarbo, on the 17th day of Tammuz. So it happens that both Batei Mikdash, both the first, in the time now of Tzidkiyahu, and the second, all the way later in 70 of the Common Era, both of those Batei Mikdash were destroyed on the ninth of Av. The walls of the city, according to the Gemara the Bavli, the walls of the city were breached in the same month, one on the ninth, one on the 17th. But the Yerushalmi disagrees. And the Yerushalmi makes this astonishing statement. And it says, Ela kilkul cheshbonot yeshkan, that actually there's a mistake on the date that it was. It was really Shiva Asar Tammuz in the first Beit HaMikdash and the second Beit HaMikdash. But as the Gemara there says, Machmat rov hatzarot shavu alehem v'lo ratzah katuv l'shanot mima shahayu sovrim. And Yirmiyahu didn't want to correct from what people thought they remembered. It's astonishing. It's found in the in the Yerushalmi, but basically it is somewhere in the middle of Tammuz is when the city was breached, when the walls of the city were breached. But Tisha Chodesh vayachazek hara'av ba'ir, the famine was very powerful. Lechem la'am haaretz, there was no bread for the people. But tibaka ha'ir, the city was breached. Now, interestingly, the form of this word, Vatibaka ha'ir, Mitzvot David says that the army of Nebuchadnezzar broke through the walls, but it's as if from the language Vatibaka ha'ir, the city was breached. It's as if it happened by itself. And the reason for that, explains Mitzvot David, is because the people were such a weakened state from this siege that there was no resistance, and so it just happens. And what ultimately, "Vatibaker b'chol anshe hamilchama halayla derech sh'ar beit hachomatayim asher al gan hamelech." And all of the people, all of the warriors, halayla. Now, again, going back to Sefer Yirmiyahu on Lamed Tet Pasuk Daled, it says, "Vayihi kasher ha'em Tzidkiyahu melech Yehuda v'chol anshe hamilchama v'yivrchu v'yitzu layla min ha'er derech gan hamelech b'shar ben hachomotayim v'yitzei derech ha'arava." That there in Yirmiyahu explains this pasuk. This pasuk is written missing words because it says again, "V'chol anshe ha'er halayla," and all of the men of war at night. What at night? Well, we know at night via the gate between the Chomotayim, the double gate or the gate between the walls that was by the gardens of the palace, but we're missing a verb. And so the Dat Mikra says actually the reason Yirmiyahu writes it like this is consciously to try to give this idea of, of how confused and how hurried things were. He's just giving some words within the narrative of what was supposed to happen. It's a mikra katzar, and it's to tell us about in the terms of the dat mikra, the pachad and the bahalam, the fear and the confusion which occurred at that moment as they were trying to escape. And what's really happening here is the king Tzidkiyahu is trying to escape, and he's taking with him his palace guard, and he's going eastward towards Yericho. Rashi quotes a medrash that there was actually a tunnel that led from Yerushalayim, an escape tunnel, all the way towards Yericho. And what happened was he's running through the tunnel, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu caused a tzvi, a deer, to run above ground over where he was, and the Babylonians chased after that deer, and when they got to the opening of the escape route of that tunnel, that's where they captured Tzidkiyahu. And that, according to Rashi, is the meaning of a pasuk in Yechezkel in Perek Yud Bet, pasuk Yud Gimel, parasti rashti alav v'nitpas b'tzudati. That God says He's going to spread His net over him and He's going to capture him in the net, because God led him into the hands of the Babylonians. And the pasuk says that the Babylonians, who are referred to as the Kasdim, if you remember, were a nation that was a little south of where Babylon was, but they're using both interchangeably. They were all around the city, and they went as well towards the Arava, towards the area of Yericho. Vayirdefu chel Kasdim achar hamelech. And the Chel Kasdim, in other words, the army chased after the king, Vayasigu oto b'arvot Yericho, and they caught him by Arvot Yericho. Arvot Yericho is the area around Yericho. It is, interestingly, the very same place where the Jews entered in the time of Yehoshua. And so there's this poetic closure to this era of the Jewish Commonwealth, that it began in Arvot Yericho and it ends in Arvot Yericho. Both of those are the same places. And while he's being captured, his people are just running away from him. They're escaping. They're scattering at that moment. Vayitpesu et hamelech, and they capture the king. Vaya'alu oto el melech Bavel Rivlata, and they bring him to the king of Bavel, to Nebuchadnezzar, who was in Rivla. Rivla is far north. It's in northern Lebanon, is where it would be today. And immediately there's a question that we have to have. And that question is, wait a second. Nebuchadnezzar was laying siege to Yerushalayim. He's laying siege to Yerushalayim. What's he doing in Rivlata in the north? That's the question of the Radak. And so the Radak explains that what happened was Nebuchadnezzar first went, and he came with all the army, but he isn't going to sit there for a year and a half waiting for the siege to happen, for it to break. And as a result, he started around Yerushalayim, and Nebuchadnezzar himself moved his camp further back north towards his home territory in Rivlah. And that's why they bring the king to Rivlah to see Nebuchadnezzar. There is a medrash, however. The medrash says that the commanding officer over Nebuchadnezzar's army, Nebuzdaran, that what he actually did is Nebuchadnezzar himself never went into Jerusalem, but rather when Nebuzdaran came, leading Nebuchadnezzar's troops, his chariot was decorated with a picture of Nebuchadnezzar. So it's like Nebuchadnezzar is arriving, his people are arriving. That's the midrash on this piece. Whichever we take, he is brought up to Rivlam, Vayidabro ito mishpat. And at that point, they entered into a judgment with him. Now, the judgment was that he rebelled. And how did he rebel? He sought out this assistance of Mitzrayim. He had, and we see this earlier, several years earlier, before the 11th year of the reign, actually before the 9th year of the reign, when the rebellion began. In the fourth, fifth year, he had sought out horses and chariots from Egypt for reinforcement so he could fight against Bavel and be independent. So the Radak says that Nebuchadnezzar brought him to justice over the fact that he rebelled. The Malbim says that when it says Vayidabru ito mishpat, who are the Vayidabru? It's the ministers of the king are laying their claims against Tzidkiyahu HaMelech. What happens? That B'nai Tzidkiyahu shachatu leinav. They've captured his princes, his sons, and they murder them right in front of him. In Yirmiyahu and Lametet Vav, it actually says, Vayishchot melech Bavel et b'nei Tzidkiyahu, that Nebuchadnezzar himself killed Tzidkiyahu's sons. If you recall, we had mentioned last week that Yechoniah is going to be the progenitor of the future Malchut Beit David, okay, but Tzidkiyahu's line is being cut off. Ve'teinei Tzidkiyahu iver, and they blinded Tzidkiyahu. Now, this was one of the cruel punishments in the ancient world, that they make sure the very last thing that a person sees is a horrific scene. And that was the horrific scene of his sons being murdered, and they blinded him at that point. Interestingly, the Dat Mikram has one more comparison, and that is if you go back to David HaMelech, where David blesses Hashem, Al Asher Natan Hayom Yoshev Al Kisi. This is the beginning of Melachim Aleph. Ve'enai Ro'ot, and my eyes see my son taking over in my role. And here, Tzidkiyahu, at the end of this commonwealth, his thing is he sees his sons who won't take over, who are being murdered. Rehu b'nechushtaim, and they bound him in chains, ve'yevi'ehu Bavel, and they brought him back to Bavel. Uvachodesh hashvi'i, and now in the seventh month, I'm sorry, the fifth month, which is the month of Av, b'shiv'a lachodesh, on the seventh day of the month of Av, he shnat chasrei shana lemelech Nebuchadnezzar melech Bavel. We're now in the 19th year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Ba Nevuzradan comes the commanding officer Rav Tabachim Eved melech Bavel Yerushalayim. He comes into Yerushalayim. He's the Rav HaTabachim. Now, this terminology of Rav Tabachim can be a couple of possibilities. The simplest one is actually what Targum Yonatan suggests. Rav Kitulaya, he is the chief executioner. Tabach, in this case, being murder. He's the chief executioner. He's the most murderous of all. He appears in Yerushalayim. The other possibility, Rav Tabachim, is very similar to what we find in other designations that used to happen. For example, in the time of Yosef, we had Sarah Tabachim, that there were positions in a king's court which originally started with one role, and over the years, the roles switched, but the titles remained the same. And so, for example, we have in Sefer Melachim, and we've had this in the last several prakim, the terminology of a saris. A saris literally was a eunuch, and they were the people who were responsible for the king's harems. But as time moved forward, these people who were appointed as sarisim were no longer eunuchs, and they were no longer responsible for harems, but they were considered ministers within the court. And so it is entirely possible that this was a person, another minister, not the murderer, not the chief executioner. His title was Rav Hatabachim. And he arrives, and he is the servant, without question, of Nebuchadnezzar himself. And he says, and when he arrives, Vayisrof et Beit Hashem vet Beit HaMelech. He burns the Beit HaMikdash, and he burns the palace, vet kol batei Yerushalayim, and also all of the major the homes in Yerushalayim, vet kol Beit Gadol Saraf Be'esh, and also all of the great houses. Now, if you have Batei Yerushalayim, what are the Beit Gadol? So Rashi says Beit Gadol. He says Batei Knesiot shemegadlim behem Torah u'tfilah Batei Asarim. He says they're a combination, both of the shuls. Now, the shul in the time of the second Beit HaMikdash, and the first Beit HaMikdash in Yerushalayim was different. They were the meeting places, the gathering places which took place, and also the houses of the ministers. The Ralbag says a little easier that Beit Gadol means not the great houses, but the houses of the great, of the important people in Yerushalayim. Now, we do have a problem because we said this is taking place on the 7th of the month of Adar, and we know Tisha B'Av is the day. In fact, we know that the majority of destruction took place late in the day on Tisha B'Av and into Yud Av. And so Seder Olam Rabbah Chav Zayin explains that there was actually a several-day process. And the Seder Olam Rabbah teaches that on the 7th day, Nebuchadnezzar came into the Beit HaMikdash, and they began to take out all of the utensils of the Beit HaMikdash, and they were destroying that building, looting it on the 7th, the 8th, and the 9th in the morning. Right before the end of the 9th, they burnt the Beit HaMikdash, and it was burning over the 10th. Now, there is a famous piece from Rav Soloveitchik about this, because there's a famous question then. If the majority of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash took place on the 10th, why do we fast on the 9th? But even more, why is it that when we hit Chatzot, midday on the 9th of Av, we come up, we sit on regular chairs, and the intensity of the experience of Tisha B'Av begins to lessen a bit. So how could it be if that's the actual time when the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed? So Rav Soloveitchik's famous explanation was, based on a midrash, that until the time when the Beit HaMikdash was being burnt, that the future of the Jewish people lay in peril. That ultimately HaKadosh Baruch Hu was making a choice: destroy the people or destroy the place. And when it came to Chatzot, midday on the 9th of Av, HaKadosh Baruch Hu made the decision to destroy the place and keep the people. And so in a sense, the greatest danger was the morning of the 9th, when God was still measuring what was the necessary outcome, what he was going to do. And at that point, once the burning of the Beit HaMikdash began, it's actually a lessening of the danger that we as a people face, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu took out his wrath on Eitzim and Avanim, on the wood and on the stone. Yeah, Lita.
Yeah, but when all the prophets, like, they talk about the destruction and everything, don't they always say within there, but Hashem's going to remember you and not totally destroy you? I mean, within their nevuot?
At the end of the day, that ultimately we will be. But what will be the future of the Jewish people? It is possible that we will violate to such an extent that the suffering will be even greater. That ultimately we do have that brit that keeps us, but that brit, look, to take a modern example, we've been in Galut and suffering the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash. This Beit HaMikdash, the suffering is a 70-year suffering. That is an earlier nevuah of Yirmiyahu, talking about 70 years. The second Beit HaMikdash, it's been 2,000 years of suffering. And during the course of that suffering, horrific things have happened, not just in modern times, but we can go back to the 17th century with Khmelnytsky massacres. We can go back earlier there and keep on going to all of those pieces. So, what happens to the people, okay, is going to be a difference as well. You're right. And yet, we can see from modern example how things can change. So, the Navi continues. Ve'et chomot Yerushalayim saviv, and regarding the walls that were all around Yerushalayim, what he did was natetzu kol chel kastim asher rav tabachim. They went ahead and at the order of the Rav Tabachim, the Ran, they went ahead and they began breaking down the walls around Yerushalayim. Vet yeter ha'am hanisharim ba'ir, and regarding all of the people who remained in the city, who survived the siege, hanoflim asher naflu, and also the people who were falling down al hamelech Bavel, before the king of Bavel. What ultimately means, Rashi explains, these are people who abandoned Jerusalem and went and fell down, begging mercy over for their lives. Okay, and all of it was the terminology of nifilah. There, it is a downward slide. Vet yeter hamon, and the remaining masses, heglan vuzdaran, Nevuzaradan. I always mispronounce it. I apologize. Nevuzaradan, Nevuzaradan, Ravatabachim. He exiled them. Now, ultimately, in these exiles, the numbers of people, which is interesting, doesn't seem to be as great as we see. Well, we see in Yirmiyahu, in Nun Bet, in Yirmiyahu, that there were the three exiles, times of exile. The Galut Yehoyakim had over 10,000 people. There were 3,000 who were exiled and another 7,000 from the rest of the other Shvatim. The Galut, after the conquest in Tammuz, which was the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar, there are 832 people who are exiled. And the Galut that will take place even later is only about 500 people. And so altogether, about 11,000 people who were exiled to Bavel. The interesting thing is that 11,000 may not sound like a lot, but we can't forget the number of people who were murdered in this and died in the siege and in the war. And we see the number of people who were killed. Umidalata Aretz. And what happened was the people who were the Dalei Haaretz, the poor, the indigent, Hishir Rav Tabachim. They were the people who the Rav Tabachim kept there. L'chormim u'liyogvim, to serve in the vineyards and to serve in the fields. Because ultimately, Eretz Yisrael was a place that was part now of the empire of Bavel. And Nebuchadnezzar didn't want Eretz Yisrael to lay fallow. He wanted Eretz Yisrael to continue to be able to pay tribute, to pay taxes. And to pay taxes, you need to have produce, but he doesn't want them to rebel. And so what he does is he takes out anybody who could cause a rebellion and leaves, the Nebuchs, who are still there to take care of things. This word Yogvim, by the way, is an unusual word. Targum Yonatan says, Mefalchin b'chaklain, that these are the people who worked in chaklaut, in farming. Radak says the same thing. He says, Ovdei Sadot, the people who work the fields. And he says it's Lashon Yechidai, it's a unique word. Rashi says it's different. He says they're the people who excavate in the land, Lashon Yekavim. Okay, and there's a chiluf of Gimel and Kuf. And in the Gemara and Shabbos says, actually, these were the people who were the hunters of the chilazot, of that snail that gave us that beautiful blue that was used in tzitzit. And they were the people who were in Sor and Tyre, and from Tyre all the way down to Haifa in terms of their area. But whatever these Yogvim were, we know clearly that what the purpose was to be able to keep Eretz Yisrael productive. Ve'et amudei hanachoshet. And now what happens is we begin to list the things that were stolen, that were stripped from the Beit HaMikdash before its destruction. So first of all, we had the Yachinu Boaz, these two massive columns which existed in the Beit HaMikdash, made of copper, Asher Beit Hashem. They took that, Vet HaMechonot, and also the portable lavers, the basins, which, if you remember, were on these carts that moved around. Vet Yam HaNechoshet, and also the Yam Shel Shlomo, that massive basin, which had the images of 12 bulls holding it up. The Yam Shel Shlomo itself was something that was so heavy that it had to be dismantled without question because it was um, so impossible to move otherwise. Asher Beveit Hashem Shibru Kasdim. The Babylonians destroyed it. The Dat Mikra estimates that the weight of the Yam Shel Shlomo empty was about 50 tons. That was how much metal was there. And they went ahead and they broke it down to be able to transport it. Breaking it down to transport it, it's true they had the metal, but they didn't care for any of the beauty, for the aesthetic. They didn't care. It was just taking the metal with them. Vayisu et nechushtam Bavel, and they took this nechoshet back with them to Bavel. ואת הסירות, ואת היעים, ואת המזמרות, ואת הכפות, ואת כל כלי הנחושת אשר ישרתו בם לקחו. And they also took all of the container, the bowls and the shovels and the musical instrument and the spoons and all of the other utensils that were there in the Beit HaMikdash. Those they took. They didn't have to break them down. Veta machtot, veta mizrakot, and also continuing on the list of different items that they took. The machteh is also a kind of a shovel, and a mizrak is a kind of thing they would use to sprinkle the blood. Asher zahav zahav, asher kesef kasef, whether it was gold or it was silver, lakach rav tabachim. They stole from the Beit HaMikdash. Hamudim shnaim, hayam echad, v'amechonot asher asa Shlomo leveit Hashem lo haya mishkal l'nechoshet kol hakelim haele. And when we talk about these larger items, the copper that covered these two large pillars and the Yam Shel Shlomo and all of the mechonot and the portable basins, there was no way to measure the amount that was in there. Just remember, it was 18 amot, each one of these columns. 18 amot is somewhere between 27 and 36 feet tall. So about 3 stories high were each of these columns that stood before the entrance to the Heichal. V'koteret alav nechoshet, and it had a capital on top of them, also made of copper. V'komat hakoteret shalosh aman, was 3 amot high, that piece as well. V'rimonim ala koteret, and there were the pomegranates of the metal pomegranates which were decorating Saviv Kol Hakol Nechoshet. All of that was made of copper. V'cha'elu l'amud hasheni ala shvacha, and also with the netting, the same thing was on the second. Yeah.
Question: it doesn't say that those things were broken, these pillars. It sounds like they just transported them, and
Well,
it leaves the decorations intact.
but if you go back to Pasuk Yud Gimel, at the end of Yud Gimel, where it's listed the first time, it says Shibru HaKasdim.
Well, but it was referring only singularly to mechonot, at mechonot vet yam nechoshet shibru kasdim, and transported their copper. But and then with all the things like the kelim, the sirot, the yaim, the mizamrot, all that is listed as being transported with the other smaller kelim. Hamudim shnayim hayam. Oh, here it says hayam ha'echad, so that gets included.
Yeah.
So
I hear the explanation. However, if we take the other approach, and remember the amudim were only plated
they were plated.
They weren't solid, so there was no purpose for them to take the thing,
Right.
the stone around which was being plated. So it would seem to be that first pasuk would also apply to them taking the
Gotcha.
plating off of it. But I hear the diuk which you're making. I haven't seen that,
Right.
but it's not, and it's good. But I
Okay.
think the idea that they stole the plating would be easier to take.
Right.
Vayikach Rab Tabachim et Tzraya Kohen Arosh, v'et Tzvanyahu Kohen Mishneh, v'et Shloshet Shomrei Asaf. And in addition, he took the three people, the three groups of people over the Beit Hamikdash. Tzraya Kohen Rosh was most likely the Kohen Gadol. Tzvanya Kohen Mishneh was the number two. Okay, and we have this principle, the Skan Kohen Gadol. And then he took the Shloshet Shomrei Hasaf. We've had the Shomrei Hasaf before. They may have been the treasurers of the Beit HaMikdash. They may have been the ones who were guarding the threshold. Shomrei Hasaf literally means the threshold of the Beit HaMikdash, meaning they were the ones who had the keys. Umin ha'ir lakach saris echad asher hu pakid al anshe milchama. And from the city he also took one of the officers who was also responsible for the the warriors, and five people who were on the inside of the palace saw the king regularly, that Sofer Saratzava, and also the Sofer Saratzava. Now, Sofer could have one of two explanations. He could have been the recorder, the scribe, but more likely than not, according to the Meforshim, his role was counting. He was the person who made sure that, according to Radak, they were ready for war. It could be also something in the nature of a quartermaster that we have in modern armies. Hamatzbi et Am Haaretz v'shishim ish me'am haaretz. He took 60 people from the Am haaretz. Now remember, the Am haaretz in this point of Malachim are not just simple people. They are the people who were trying to place various kings into their roles. And so they were the ones, the Am haaretz, who initially appointed Yoachaz. Okay, they wanted to continue the policies of Menashe and Ammon before him. So they took 60 of them, Vayikachotam Levuzar Adan Rab Tabachim, and he took them, Vayolechotam al Melech Bavel Rivlata, and he brought them up to Bavel, Vayachotam Melech Bavel, Vayamitem Berivla Be'eretz Chamat. And they were killed, they were executed there. Vayigel Yehuda me'alad mato. And summary statement, the Jewish people were exiled from their land. Va'aman ishar be'eretz Yehuda, asher hishir Nebuchadnezzar melech Bavel. And regarding the people who had been left, those people, vayavked alehem et Gedaliyahu ben Achikam ben Shaphan. He placed over them Gedaliyahu. Now, this is Gedalia, as we know from Tzom Gedalia. And in order to understand the story is not conveyed here in depth. It's conveyed in Sefer Yirmiyahu, and I had sent that to you. And I just want to take this time now to go through that story. And so I'm going to bring it up on screen in case you didn't print it out and have it available. But up on screen right now, you'll see it. Let me just see if I can make it a little larger for you. Okay, and where Gedaliah first comes into his role, actually, is earlier in the picture. Earlier in the picture, Yirmiyahu had been placed in prison by Tzidkiyahu. Yirmiyahu was not beloved by the people because he kept on telling them, if they don't do better, they're going to be killed. They're going to be destroyed. The people are going to be exiled. Yirmiyahu's advice to the king had been, work with the Babylonians, don't try to rebel against the Babylonians. And Yirmiyahu throughout this has warned them what might happen, and so they put him in prison. Umina Amad Dalim Nebuzaradan, okay, went ahead, and he took from the poor people that were left, Asher Ein Lehem Umah, who had nothing, Hishir Nebuzaradan Rav Tabachim Beretz Yudah v'yiten lehem kramim v'yigavim bayomahu. And he left them, and we saw this also in our Sefer, what he did, he gave them the vineyards and the fields. Vayitzav Nebuchadnezzar melech Bavel al Yirmiyahu, Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of Bavel, then gave a command regarding the future of Yirmiyahu. Nebuchadnezzar, actually Nebuchadnezzar is closer to his Babylonian name. They're used interchangeably, but it's still the same Nebuchadnezzar. And he said, Kachenu ve'enecha sim alav al tas lo me'uma. Okay, take him, look after him. Don't do anything to this Yirmiyahu. Kim kasher deber elecha ken aseh imo. only what I tell you to do. Vayishlach Nebuzaradan, Rav Tabachim, Unevushazban, Rav Saris, Benargel Sharetzar, Rav Mag, Vechol Rabbe Melech Bavel. And so Nebuzaradan, who was in charge, sent, and everybody else, all of these important officers went, Vayishlechu, Vayikhu et Yirmiyahu Mechatzar Matara, and they took Yirmiyahu out of prison. ויתנו אותו אל גדליהו בן אחיקם בן שפן, להוציאהו אל הבית, וישב בתוך העם. And so they gave him over to Gedaliah. Now, Gedaliah, if you remember, in terms of his yichus, what's important here, Achikam, okay, Gedaliah ben Achikam. Achikam was a minister by Yoshiyahu and also by Yehoiakim. We've encountered his father before. Shaphan was also one of the ministers who worked with Yoshiyahu. And so Gedaliah is a person with tremendous credibility. He's a person who worked for the son of a person and the grandson of a person who worked for a great king who brought greatness to the Jewish people. And he brought him and he gave him over to Gedaliah. At that point, he had actually given Yirmiyahu choices of what he could do, and Yirmiyahu wanted to stay with the people. The next parak begins, and I skip over a large chunk at the end of Lamitet, and V'hadavar asher hayal Yirmiyahu me'et Hashem achar shalach oto Nevuzar Adan Rav Tabachim min harama b'kachto oto v'hu asur ba'azikim b'toch kol galut Yerushalayim v'Yehuda megulim bavela. And now he gets a nevuah, and the nevuah is after he was freed by Nebuchadnezzar. ויקח רב טבחים לירמיהו, ויאמר אליו השם אלוקיך דיבר את הרעה הזאת אל המקום הזה. And he said to him, HaKadosh Baruch Hu has pronounced that all this evil is going to happen. Vaya'ez Hashem kasher diber, and God did what he said he was going to do. Ki chatatem l'Hashem v'lo shamatem b'kolo, v'haya lachem hadavar hazeh. And you did it because you sinned. You didn't listen to God. ועתה, הנה פיתחתיך היום מן האזיקים אשר על ידיך, אם טוב בעיניך לבוא איתי בבל, בוא ואשים את עיני עליך. And so he's told, listen, Yirmiyahu, you want to come? Come back with us to Bavel, and I'll take care of you. ואם רע בעיניך, if you don't want to come, לבוא איתי בבל חדל, and you don't have to come. ראה כל הארץ לפניך, אל טוב ואל הישר בעיניך ללכת שם. Go wherever you want to go. בעודנו לא ישוב, okay? ושב ושובה אל גדליהו בן אחיקם בן שפן אשר הפקיד מלך בבל בערי יהודה ושב איתו בתוך העיר. Yirmiyahu didn't want to go anywhere, and so Yirmiyahu went back to Gedaliah. Gedaliah had been placed as the governor. And he gave him food, he gave him some present, and he let him go. Yirmiyahu went to Gedaliah to Mitzpah. Mitzpah is a little north of Yerushalayim, and it was there where Gedaliah set up his governorship. וישמעו כל שרי החיילים אשר בשדה המה ואנשיהם אשר הפקיד מלך בבל את גדליהו בן אחיקם בארץ. And now the people who were the soldiers, the army of the Jews who had been hiding out after the destruction, they heard, וכי הפקיד אותו אנשים ונשים וטפו מגדולת הארץ באשר לא הגלה בבלה, and they heard that he's the governor, and they heard that he had all of these people, the poor and the indigent, to take care of the land. ויבואו אל גדליהו המצפתה. So the armies that had been hiding, they came to Gedaliah. And they also, וישמעאל בן נתניהו, ויוחנן ויונתן בן קרח, ואוסריה בן תנחומת, Uvnei Ophai Hanetofati, Vizanyahu ben Hamachati, Hema van Shem, and all of these other people who were significant people. Ishmael is going to be an important person. Vayishavalem Gedaliah ben Achikam ben Shaphan, Ulan Hashem lemor. And Gedaliah swore to them. He made a promise to them. Now notice we use Gedaliah's father's name and grandfather's name because that's his yichus. We quote them because they were important. Al tiru, don't be afraid. Me avoda kastim. Don't be afraid to serve the Babylonians. Shavu ba'aretz v'yivdu et hamelech bavel v'yitav lachem. Serve the king and things will work out. V'ani inini yoshev b'mitzpah. And Gedaliah says, I'm going to be here in Mitzpah. La'amod lifnei hakastim, and I'll stand up before the Bavlim asher yavo elenu, who come to us. V'atem yisfu yayin v'kayitz v'shemen, and you'll be gathering your wine, and you'll do the summer grains, and also the oil. V'simu bichlechem, and put them in your vessels, ushvu barechem asher tafastem, and live where you want to live. וגם כל היהודים אשר במואב ובני עמון ואדום ואשר בכל הארצות שמעו, and the Jews who had escaped to the neighboring lands, they heard of what was happening. כי נתן מלך בבל שארית, that the king of Bavel, Nebuchadnezzar, had given an opportunity for Yehuda to continue. וכי הפקיד עליהם את גדליהו בן אחיקם בן שפן, and that he put Gedaliah in charge. וישובו כל היהודים מכל המקומות אשר נדחו שם, ויבוא ארץ יהודה לגדליהו מצפתה ויאספו יין וקיץ הרבה מאוד. And they began to work the land and bring back in the produce. ויוחנן בן קרח וכל שרי החיילים אשר בשדה באו על גדליהו מצפתה. And again, the armies began to show up. ויאמר אליו, but Yochanan tells him now, היודעות תדע, כי בעליס מלך בני עמון. There is a plot happening. Balis, who's the king of Ammon, Shalachid Yishmael ben Netanyah lakodcha, has hired Yishmael, the son of Netanyah, to kill you. Lakodcha nefesh. V'lo imin lahem Gedaliah ben Achikam. Now, what's happening in this story is Yishmael ben Netanyah is actually from Malchut Beit David. And he is objecting to Gedaliah being in charge because he says Gedaliah has no rights. I have rights. And he creates this alliance with Balis, the king of Ammon, who has many reasons not to let the Jews control Eretz Yisrael. But Gedaliah doesn't believe. V'Yochanan ben Kareach amar el Gedaliah b'seiter b'mitzpeh lemor. Yochanan tells Gedaliah secretly saying, Elchana v'aket Yishmael ben Netanyah. Let me at least kill Yishmael. He wants to kill you. Let me take care of him. No one will know. Lama yakeka nefesh v'nafotzu kol Yehuda nikbatzim elecha ve'avda sherit Yehuda. He said, why should he kill you and then all the Jews will be scattered? Vayomer Gedaliah ben Achikam el Yochanan ben Kareach al ta'aseh et hadavar hazeh. Don't do this. Ki sheker atah dover el Yishmael. Because you're telling me a lie. This is not true about Yishmael. Gedaliah didn't want to believe it. Vayihi b'chodesh hashvi'i. It is now Tishrei. Yishmael ben Netanyah ben Elishama mizera hamlucha. V'rabei hamelech ve'asara anashim ito el Gedaliah ben Achikam hamitzpata. Okay, along comes Yishmael, and he is from the royal king. He was an officer. He comes to Gedaliah. And they eat together in Mitzpah. Now, why are they eating together in Mitzpah? This is Rosh Hashanah. They came for lunch. Right? Yakom Yishmael ben Netanyah v'aseret anashim asher hayu ito. Vayaku et Gedaliah ben Achikam, and they killed Gedaliah b'charav. Vayamet oto. They murdered him. Asher ifkid melech Bavel ba'aretz. Okay, and this was the person who Nebuchadnezzar had made governor over the land. ואת כל היהודים אשר היו איתו את גדליהו במצפה ואת הכסדים אשר נמצא שם את אנשי המלחמה היכה ישמעאל. Yishmael murdered everyone who was around. ויהי ביום השני, and that's the day after להמית את גדליהו, after they killed Gedaliah, ואיש לא ידע, no one still knew about it because they'd murdered everybody. ויבואו אנשים משכם, משילה משומרון. And now there's a group of people who are coming from the north. Shmonim ish, there's 80 of them. Migulchei zakan ukrei v'gadim umitgodadim. These are people who are exhibiting signs of mourning. Uminchal levona b'yadam lavi Beit Hashem, and they're planning on bringing a korban to the Beit Hamikdash. Apparently, they didn't know that the Beit Hamikdash had been destroyed. Vayetze Yishmael ben Netanyah likratam, and Yishmael comes out to meet them. Mina mitzpah, holech haloch uvocheh. And he's crying. Vayhi kifgosh otam vayomer lehem boel Gedaliah ben Achikam. He says, come on in, let's go to Gedaliah. Vayhi kivoam el toch ha'ir, when they get into the city of Mitzpah, vayishchatem Yishmael ben Netanyah, Yishmael murdered them. El toch habor hu vanashim asher ito, and he threw them into a pit. He and all the other people who were with them. 80 people were murdered. V'asara anashim nimtzau vam, vayomer el Yishmael al tamitenu ki yesh lanu matmonim b'sadeh. But 10 people were there, and they said to Yishmael, don't kill us. We have things hidden in the field, chitim, usorim, v'shemen, udvash, v'yachadal, v'loim, itam b'toch achem. And so he didn't kill him. V'abor asher yishlich sham Yishmael et kol pigrei anashim asher yika b'yad Gedaliyahu. And all of the people who were thrown, all those bodies that were thrown into the pit, who were killed alongside Gedaliyahu, hu asher asa melech asa mipnei basha melech Yisrael. This is that pit that we had encountered earlier in Sefer Melachim between Basa and Asa. Oto milei Yishmael ben Netanyahu chalalim. Yishmael filled it with bodies. Vayish Yishmael et kol sherit ha'am asher b'mitzvah, et benot hamelech v'et kol ha'am anisherim b'mitzvah asher ivki nevuz radan rav tavachim v'et Gedaliyahu ben Achikam, vayishbem Yishmael ben Netanyahu v'yelech v'lavor et bnei Ammon. And Yishmael then went ahead and captured the remaining people who were there and took them back to Ammon, to the enemy nation. Vayishma Yochanan ben Kareach v'chol sarei hachayalim asher ito et kol hara asher asa Yishmael ben Netanyahu. Now Yochanan hears. This is the one who had warned Gedaliah, and he hears. Vayikhu et kol anashim vayelchu lilachem im Yishmael ben Netanyahu v'yimtzu oto al mayim rabim asher begivon. And they found him in Givon. They found Yishmael there. Vayikru et kol am asher et Yishmael et Yochanan ben Kareach v'et kol sarei hachayalim asher ito v'yismachu. When all the people who were with Yishmael saw Yochanan, they were all happy. Vayasobu kol ha'am asher shava Yishmael min hamitzvah vayashuvu v'yelchu liYochanan ben Kareach. So all the people who Yishmael had carried away, they went back. Yishmael ben Netanyahu nimlat b'shmona anashim mipnei Yochanan v'yelech el bnei Ammon, and Yishmael escapes with his 8 inner people. Vayikach Yochanan ben Kareach v'chol sarei hachayalim asher ito et kol sherit ha'am asher yeshiv meit Yishmael ben Netanyahu min hamitzvah asher achar ha'ika et Gedaliyahu ben Achikam gvarim anshe ha'melchama v'nashim v'tafas harisim asher yeshiv migivon. And Yochanan takes all of these people who had been captured by Yishmael, vayelchu vayeshvu begerut kimaham asher etzel beit lechem lalecha lavo Mitzrayim. And they went south towards Beit Lechem in order to go into Egypt. Mipnei HaKasdim, ki yaru mipneihem. They were afraid of the Babylonians. Ki hikai Yishmael ben Netanyahu Gedaliyahu ben Achikam asher ivkid melech Bavel ba'aretz. Because they had killed. In other words, their act of killing Gedaliah was an act of rebellion. He had been put in place by the king of Bavel. And so by them killing, when Yishmael killed Gedaliah, wasn't just the end of independent rule, which we mourn, but it was also an act of rebellion, and they're running away to Mitzrayim. They took with them, when they run away to Mitzrayim, they take with them Yirmiyahu against his will. Yirmiyahu doesn't want to go to Mitzrayim, but they basically kidnap him to take him with. And now to go back into our Navi.
Rabbi,
Yes.
just a question. Didn't Gedaliah check with Yirmiyahu about whether he should believe, that it's a true story, or
We don't see any checking on this.
right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Vayishmu kol, I'm in Posuk Chav Gimel. Vayishmu kol sarei hachayalim hema v'anashim asher ivkid melech Bavel et Gedaliyahu. We read about this already in Yirmiyahu. The people who had been hiding here, that Gedaliyahu is in charge. Vayavo el Gedaliyahu hamitzvah. They come to Gedaliyahu. Yishmael ben Netanyahu, the evil one. V'Yochanan ben Kareach, the one who tried to warn him. Usraya ben Tanchumet Hanetofti. Tofati v'Yahu ben Amachati Hema v'Ansheim, and they all show up. V'Yishava lehem Gedaliyahu l'Ansheim v'Yomer lehem al tir'u me'avdei hakastim. Gedaliyahu tells them, don't be worried about the Babylonians. Shavu ba'aretz v'avdu et melech Bavel v'yitav lachem. Stay here, and it'll be good for you. V'yihi b'chodesh hashvi. It was in the 7th month. By Yishmael ben Netanyahu ben Elishama mizera amlucha ve'asara nashim ito. And along comes Yishmael. He was from royal lineage. 10 people with him. Vayaku et Gedaliyahu vayamot v'et hayudim v'et hakasdim asher hayu ito b'mitzvah. And he kills everyone along the way. Vayakumu kol ha'am mikaton v'agadol v'sarei hachayalim vayavo Mitzrayim ki yaru mipnei hakasdim. And everyone escapes to Mitzrayim because now they're afraid, what is Bavel going to do? Vayihim b'shloshim v'sheva shana legalut Yoyachin melech Yehuda. It is the 37th year since Yehoiachin was exiled. B'shneim asar chodesh, it's in the 12th month. This is Adar, Be'esrim v'shiva l'chodesh, on the 27th day, Nasa Evil Merodach Melech Bavel. Evil Merodach, Nebuchadnezzar's son, lifted up Ishnat Malchot Roshi Yoyachin Melech Yehuda mi Beit HaKela, and he brought him out of jail. Vayedaber ito tovot, and he spoke kindly to him. Vayiten et kis'o me'al kisei hamelachim asher ito beBavel, and he placed Yoyachin in a place of honor among all of the defeated kings who were there in Bavel. He had the highest seat. Shina et bigdei kichil'o, and he changed him out of his prison garb. V'achal lechem tamid lefanav kol yimei chayav, and he ate alongside Avil Merodach, the king of Bavel, all of his life. Varuchato aruchat tamid nitna lo me'et hamelech devar yom beyomo kol yemei chayav, and all the rest of his life, he ate alongside the king of Bavel. And this is the way Malachim ends. Now, interestingly, there could have been two different ends to Malachim. If you want to talk about Malachim as the chronology of the kings, Tzidkiyahu's death and the destruction of Yerushalayim, and then the murder of Gedaliah should have been the end of the Sefer. Why was this piece added at the end of the Sefer? And the answer is because Sefer Melachim is not a Sefer of doom and destruction. Sefer Melachim is ultimately a book of hope. And as a result, what Yirmiyahu wanted to do was give us that hope and make sure that we understand that at the end, there's something still going to be. There's some future, there's some light in this tunnel. Interestingly, this parak, we find almost precisely the same thing as the last parak of Sefer Yirmiyahu. And according to the Abarbanel, Yirmiyahu copied the final parak of Sefer Melachim and put it into the end of his book to also provide that sense of summation, that it all came together, that unfortunately the prophecies came true, but at the same time, there's still an element of hope that's going to be coming. Next week, we're going to start Sefer Daniel. And in Sefer Daniel, what we're going to see is what happened in the Galut. It is a complicated Sefer, as some of you may remember. There are two parts to Sefer Daniel. There are large swaths of it in Aramaic. And yet it's a book, not only that people, unfortunately, because of the Aramaic, don't study often, but it's a book that has so much about Geulah within it that's going to bring us forward to the next step. And with this, we'll stop today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mazel tov to everyone for finishing the Sefer.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.